So I am just going to wait a few moments to let everybody come into the room, and we will get started shortly. We'll give it another moment. So we can get started pretty much on time. Okay, it looks like the numbers of folks coming in that has maintained. So I am going to start and welcome everyone to our panel discussion on breaking the silence, addressing depression and suicide in the legal community. My name is Amy Levine. I'm the Director of Programs and Volunteers, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for today. But before I introduce the panelists, I want to acknowledge that today's discussion will address the topics of depression and suicide. This is an important and necessary conversation, but we recognize it may be emotionally challenging for some. Please prioritize your well-being throughout the session. And if at any point you feel overwhelmed or need support, we encourage you to step away, take a break, or seek assistance. And if you or someone you know is considering dying by suicide, please call or text 988 and they can provide support and assistance. They are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Thank you for being here and engaging with this critical subject in a compassionate and thoughtful way. If you have any questions after we finish the discussion, please use the chat or the Q&A feature, and we will get to those at the end. And it is my honor to introduce our panelists. We're going to start with Dan Lukasik. Dan is the Judicial Wellness Coordinator for the New York State Office of Court Administration. He is an adjunct professor of law at the University of Buffalo School of Law. And one of his latest endeavors, he created the film, My Brother Lost in Time, A Bipolar Life. And that can be viewed on PBS. Dan also speaks on mental health for bar associations, CLE programs, judicial organizations, and law schools. Finally, he created the website lawyerswithdepression.com. Next, Stephanie Mitchell-Hughes is an attorney and the Assistant Director of the National Alliance on Mental Illness in Ohio. She speaks, writes, and presents at national conferences on living with a mental illness, resilience, and well-being in the legal profession. She's a frequent podcast guest and hosts LinkedIn live podcast entitled Resilience 2.0. Finally, she is a workplace disruptor and mental health innovator. Next, Terry Bentley Hill is a Dallas criminal defense attorney and a nationally recognized mental health advocate and a vocal proponent for mental health rehabilitation in the criminal justice system. Terry is a writer, speaker, and CLE presenter, and through her advocacy for attorney wellness was recognized by receiving a variety of awards, which include, but not limited to, the Texas Bar Foundation Terry Lee Grantham Award and the Mental Health of America Greater Dallas Prism Award, just to name a few. Finally, Terry launched her own nonprofit foundation with a focus on mental health awareness and education called #StopMindingYourOwnBusiness.com. Last but absolutely not least is Gavin Alexander, who is the Wellbeing Director at Jackson Lewis. He is a passionate advocate and thought leader in the areas of mental health, well-being, and diversity, equity, inclusion in the legal profession. Gavin served as the first ever fellow of the SJC Standing Committee on Lawyer Wellbeing. He is also a mental health first aid instructor and certified corporate wellness specialist. He speaks regularly at law firms, law schools, conferences, courts, bar associations, and other institutions. He recently authored Influencing Lawyer Wellbeing with Collaborative Clarity for the PLI Chronicle. It's an excellent article. I encourage people to read that. And he was named one of the best LGBTQ plus attorneys under 40 by the National LGBTQ plus Bar Association and inducted as a fellow of the American Bar Foundation and received the Kevin Larkin Memorial Award for public service from the Massachusetts LGBTQ Bar Association, just to name a few. And I encourage everyone to read our panelists' full bio on our website. So let's begin. And I want to start the discussion by asking our panelists to share their stories about depression and suicide. And then if you could share what made you decide or want to participate in this panel. So let's start with Gavin.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you all for being here today. I genuinely can't express in words how empowering it is to be talking about this subject on a voluntary webinar where we have 68 attendees who have showed up today at this busy time of year to hear and talk about this critical topic. My story, the short version, because I don't want to take up too much space here when all of us have amazing and powerful stories and a lot to share to talk about today. But the short version is I grew up in a family where I was told rich people had therapists and mental health care, and people like us had friends, and it was not something we should consider. It was not something I should ask for, and that was a lesson I internalized at a young age. I realized I had started having symptoms of depression by age 12. I felt comfortable enough to come out as bisexual by 16. I did not feel comfortable enough to tell a single living soul that I felt like I was experiencing mental illness until I was 30. And that was way too late. I always presented as an extremely high performer. I graduated, I actually started, I'll share this in Massachusetts. I don't share this more widely because it's less relevant to people, but I started my legal education at BU Law. I had the #1 GPA in my section. I transferred to Harvard Law. I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, got the clerkship with former Chief Justice Gantz at the SJC, got the summer associate position at the AmLaw top 10 firm, worked my ass off and consistently got exceptional performance reviews, consistently billed above expectations, you name it. On paper, I looked like I was succeeding by every possible metric. And internally, I was dying. I did not seek any help. My symptoms got worse and worse. I thought about ending my life pretty much every single day of every single exam period during law school, the worst of which was that first exam period. I felt the financial pressure of having to provide for myself and my family while having accrued over $200,000 in student loan debt for law school. While transitioning to becoming a mid-level associate at my firm, really struggled with that burden of taking on added responsibility for making judgment calls, managing teams, things like that. And when I sought an opportunity to potentially leave my firm to go in-house somewhere, I thought that the in-house interview went really poorly. They actually thought it went fine, but I thought it went poorly. And on the way home from that interview, I felt I had no way out of a situation that was becoming unmanageable for me. I was crying all the time. I was barely sleeping. And on the way home from that interview, I leaned in front of an oncoming Green Line train with the intent of jumping and dying. A random woman grabbed my arm and stopped me from doing so. And that's why I'm alive today, very likely. And I went home and told my partner what had happened, and they said, well, you need medical care immediately. So I got some medical care and I started making some changes. And then I started getting really interested in the question of why I thought it was more rational to die than to get help. And that's what eventually led me to start researching and advocating more and more into this space, and eventually pivoting my career from legal practice into advocating for this work, because I don't want to see others who feel that the most rational or only or best option for them is to die. I want to encourage folks to know that there are options that are better than that, and do more as a profession to mitigate the risk of people hitting those crisis points, rather than putting the sole burden on themselves to take care of themselves.
Thank you, Gavin. That was a very powerful story. Really appreciate and everybody's vulnerability and sharing their story. Terry, how about you?
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here and having the opportunity to talk about such an important topic. We all need to know that this is a reality, and the more we talk about it, the more we really deal with the stigma that surrounds this topic. And I know we're going to get into that. I'm a survivor of suicide. Not once, but twice. I say I'm a survivor with a capital S because I'm one of the ones who has been left behind. My former husband died almost 30 years ago. And then 9 years after that, I'm the mother of four daughters. And 9 years after he died, I lost my daughter to suicide as well, my youngest daughter. And what I have learned is that there and just like Gavin said, I was married to a public official who we were trapped in a seal of secrecy because we were afraid that, and I say we because it was a family disease. He had a substance use disorder, alcoholism, as well as mental health issues that were never diagnosed because he didn't want to go to a doctor and be diagnosed because he was afraid that if anyone found out about his issues, he would never be elected to his position again. And so we were trapped in this veil of secrecy. So I didn't get help. He didn't get help. And oftentimes when you don't deal with what's going on, it can actually be fatal. And in our case, it was. So I decided that, and especially after my daughter died, there had to be purpose for this incredible amount of pain that I was feeling and experiencing. And the one thing I realized is that talking about it not only helped me, but my story helped other people. That's why I wanted to be on the panel today. And thank you so much for including me.
Thank you, Terry. Again, another very powerful story. And you had mentioned stigma, and I think your story certainly will be helpful, and everybody's story here today. Dan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to everybody who's joined this important program. I'm 63. I'm a lawyer in Buffalo for the first 30 years of my career as a trial lawyer. My first 10 years in New York City, and then thereafter throughout New York State. When I was about 40 or 23 years ago, I was the managing partner at my law firm and was diagnosed with major depression. Very difficult thing to go through on every single level you can think of. Law firm, partners, lines of credit, clients, my family, myself. So, it was a very difficult thing to go through. And I think one of the most defining features of it for me, my depression, was the loneliness I felt. We're a very different time in our culture, especially in our legal culture. Not too long ago, a discussion like this, a program like this would have been unimaginable. Not only about suicide, but anything, depression, anxiety, stress. So at that time, it was a very lonely time for me, and I didn't know anybody with depression. I certainly didn't know any lawyers with depression. So sometime, recovery is a relative thing, right? I've recovered from depression. 23 years later, I still experience depression. I'm experiencing depression right now. I mean, I think that's it. But on the hopeful, positive end, it's gotten much, much, much better for a variety of reasons, which I think we'll dig down into today. why I think it's important to be part of the panel is because for the last 15 years ago, I started a depression support group for lawyers in my community. So we're still going strong 15 years later. We first started it, it was once a month and twice a month, and now it's twice a week. All kinds of people join into it. They're all lawyers. It's confidential, and we don't have to explain everything. But certainly, what's been a hard part of that sometimes is throughout those years, we have had serious suicide attempts, and we've lost a few people to suicide, unfortunately. Most recently in my own life, why this rings true is I'm a family of 5 kids. I'm number 4. My younger brother, Paul, who passed away about a year and a half ago, was about 3 years younger than me. And he was a brilliant, brilliant person and a successful businessman. But unfortunately, he was afflicted with bipolar disorder, which is a form of depression. We forget about that. So we had mental illness in common, he and I, and we had a tremendous amount of love between us. And when he died a year and a half ago from that illness, it was really devastating to me on many levels. Uh, so life is mysterious, right? So people drop into our lives when we need them most sometimes. And uh, 9 months ago, I was sitting at a Starbucks trying to think of an article to write about my brother for my website, and I met this person who I hadn't seen in a while, and he said, "You should meet my son. He's moving back to Buffalo from Santa Fe, and he's an independent filmmaker and dense guy that I am." I said, "Well, happy to meet him. Why would I want to meet him?" And he said, "Well, you should think about doing a film about your relationship with your brother. My son has worked for PBS, and he's a cinematographer." So I met with this young man. He looks like a young Jim Croce with no mustache. And he heard my story about my brother and I. And I said, "Listen, man, I don't have the kind of money to pay you to do a film of what you deserve to be paid." And I'll never forget, it was, he said, "Don't worry about it, man. I'm a storyteller, and I want to tell this story. And I have depression. I mean, what are the chances of that happening?" So it was just the two of us for a few months working on this. And then other people dropped into it out of the sky. And this wealthy philanthropist dropped in and said, "I want to fund all this." And he paid for venues, he hired a marketing team. I mean, way beyond anything I could have done. So it premiered live at 2 different large venues here in Buffalo, and then it was on PBS television last month, and you could watch it on YouTube now. So I guess I'm kind of decompressing from that whole experience. I feel a sense of peace about it, but I also feel very, very strongly about continuing my work on mental health, not only in the legal profession, but for anybody who struggles with mental illness. So I'm very honored and humbled to be here.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I do want to watch that documentary. So thank you for letting us know about it. And I'm sure our viewers would be interested in that as well. Stephanie, would you like to share?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Amy, on the program. And um, my own story is in some respects similar to everyone else's in some ways. I have lived with depression episode and what I describe as generous episodes of suicidal thinking probably for at least 46 years, probably more than that. I was a melancholy child, but the first episode of depression that I can recall was when I was 15 years old. And just to give some context, I was 15, and I know this may seem ancient to some people, but I was 15 in 1978. And in 1978, mental health hospitals were still open in some cities. I know they were open in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I was born and raised. And in that particular time, I certainly did not have language to tell my parents that I was depressed or how I felt or why I felt the way that I did. If I had gone to them and tried to talk to them about it, they would have asked me, as most parents probably would ask, well, what is it that you have to be depressed about? You lead a charmed life. You get everything that you want. You live in a really nice community. You go to an excellent school. You're really active. You are and involved in all these different activities. You get good grades. Why? What is it that you have to be depressed about? But what I wound up doing at that time was learning to anticipate periods of what I described as dark and heaviness when they would come, and then what caused them to come, and how I could quickly escape. And that served me very well through high school, through undergrad, through college, through law school, all of that. I could figure out how to do that and navigate that. And then when I was 30 years old, I got married. I then went on to have two children, and I was practicing law in the very traditional way. I was practicing, oddly enough, labor and employment law. That is where I've spent the bulk of my career as a lawyer. And life just kind of went along. And then in 2006, I experienced a sea-changing event. And for me, that sea-changing event was the ending of my marriage. And the ending of my marriage was for me like pulling a cork out of a champagne bottle. Um, it was um, everything. It caused everything that I had been holding in for at least a decade, caused all of that to just come pouring out. And one of those things that came pouring out was now this raging, firmly entrenched depression. In the midst of all of that, I also lived with the suicide voice in my head that told me to end my life every day, like a jackhammer. And it took me, because at that time I was going to need a very, very different type of way of managing the depression, this new depression that I had. And it took me a long time to come to terms with the depression that I had, to accept the type of treatment, because initially what I would do is I would take the medication that I was prescribed, and I would take it for a while, I'd feel better, I'd come off. Take it for a while, feel better, come off. And in the midst of all of that, at that time in 2006, I was representing children who were abused and neglected in the child welfare system. And I was also representing children as an attorney guardian ad litem in post-divorce decree cases. And so I did not have health insurance. And I was kind of piecing my mental health together and just kind of slapping it together as I went along. I also became, for all intensive purposes, my children's only parent. And so there was just a lot of stuff happening and a lot of moving pieces. And so it took a while for me to get all of that, like pull everything together and begin to roll on all four cylinders, if you will. But in the process of taking medication prescribed as feeling better and going off, the internist who I had at the time just said to me, you know, you keep doing this to yourself over and over and over again. And she asked me how long I was going to do that because I would go into her office, she would patch me up and send me back out to only do the same thing all over again. And she said that, you know, you're going to have to continue taking antidepressants and learning how to manage your mental illness in a particular way for a season. And that season may last your entire life. But the bottom line is that you have to and you deserve to be stable for yourself and also for your children. And for whatever reason, at that time, it just clicked with me. Because in the midst of coming off, I would become suicidal.
Mm.
And, you know, I could envision myself just jumping off of a building and I couldn't go and check myself into a facility and say, please help me because I'm falling apart because I was my children's only parent. I didn't have family in the city where I lived. And I could not leave my children in that way because it would have been very traumatizing for them in the midst of them experiencing their own personal trauma. So it took me a while, but I started taking the medication as prescribed. And for me, in I guess my decision to begin telling my story happened about a decade ago in 2013, in late 2013, I had the opportunity to share my story at TEDx Columbus. And then after that, it just kind of moved on from there because I looked around the profession. And at that time, in 2014, I had been practicing for about 26 years. And in my opinion, the profession really didn't look any different in terms of well-being in 2014 than it did when I walked in the door in 1988. And I felt that if you know I'm a little bit longer in the tooth than young lawyers, I had a lot less to lose, and I felt that it was important to begin telling my story. And that's really where it started for me. I started writing. I used to be one of HuffPost's unpaid contributors, and I just kind of just have kept going from there because this issue is here. I think that for a profession that is constantly thinking 3, 4 steps ahead, looking and assessing risk, the downsides of things, and advising people, we do a poor job of essentially taking our own advice and addressing our issues before we hit the bottom, the bottom of the pit there. And then we are in trouble, or our clients are in trouble because we were not really able to represent them competently, and we start to self-medicate with other things. And so that is why I started telling my story. Too many people have suffered. Too many people, unfortunately, have taken their own lives. And we have to, at some point, draw a line in the sand and begin having uncomfortable conversations, difficult conversations, but absolutely critical and life-saving conversations. So that is why I do what I do.
Excellent. Stephanie, I think you hit the nail on the head. These are critical conversations, and hopefully this conversation can save somebody's life and encourage folks to get the help. I am going to change the topic a little bit because I want folks to understand the landscape of the legal profession. However, before we dig into some of that data around the depression and suicide in the legal profession, I want to take a moment to talk about the language we use in this area. And Gavin, I know you're an advocate for using inclusive and thoughtful language. Do you want to quickly share some information on this?
Yeah, appreciate it, Amy. The language around suicide and depression have changed a lot over the years and continue to change, like all forms of inclusive language. So I encourage folks to stay aware, especially when lives are on the line, right? And as we'll talk about later, stigmatization is critical to the high rates of depression and suicidality in the legal profession. So if we use language that continues to reinforce that stigma, then the likelihood of increased depression and suicidality increases. Whereas if we use language that is more inclusive and less stigmatizing, that small act can create a culture where people are more likely to engage with supportive resources and not view themselves as a failure or as someone who can't see a path forward for themselves. So the most common phrasing and change in language, and most important is most of us on this call, I'd say anyone who's old enough to be a lawyer now, grew up using the phrase committed suicide or commits suicide. The biggest change there is if you can take one thing away from today as an action item to yourself, I encourage you to remove that phrase from your lexicon and replace it with died by suicide. Suicide is a cause of death. It is not a crime that one commits. It is not something that one gets committed to an institution for. It is not something, a selfish act that one commits. It is a medical cause of death. So like you would say someone died from cancer, you would say someone died from suicide or died by suicide. Similarly, if we reinforce the notion that when people attempt to die by suicide, they are successful or unsuccessful. It creates a weird paradigm of successful being aligned with death, whereas unsuccessful being aligned with life. So I'd encourage you to replace those terms with just, again, describing the facts. Did someone die by suicide or did someone survive a suicide attempt? That is factually what occurred without any judgmental or qualitative language there. And by the way, if someone is talking about themselves, everyone has the right to use whatever language they want to use to describe their own experience. So these are guidelines I share when you're just talking about someone else. But if you're talking about yourself, feel free to choose whatever language you'd like. I also encourage people to avoid describing others as being suicidal. Now, I can say I am feeling suicidal because that's how I describe my own lived experience. But if you're talking about someone else, again, that is a sort of adjective of suicidal. What are you actually saying? That you're worried they are considering harming themselves or considering dying by suicide, that they have suffered through a recent death by suicide, that they recently attempted to die by suicide, or that you're worried about that they're experiencing such severe mental illness in another category, such as depression or anxiety, that they are experiencing suicidal thoughts or suicidal ideation being the more medical term. So just some quick suggestions there.
Gavin, those were excellent comments. Thank you so much. And as we've talked about in the past, that language shapes thoughts and thoughts shape language. So definitely, I think that's an important note. So thank you. What I also want to do is I just want to go through some statistics. And most recently, there was a study that the NORC did on lawyer well-being, which was specifically in Massachusetts. And it was published in 2023. It showed that the majority of Massachusetts lawyers, 77%, reported burnout from their work, reported high rates of anxiety, 26%, depression, 21%, and suicidal ideation, 7%, and hazardous or unhealthy alcohol use, 42%. Other studies have shown that lawyers have consistently been or near the top of the list of professions that in suicide rates. And other studies have shown lawyers have shown to be the most often depressed professionals out of 105 professions. A recent study showed that lawyers are 3 times more likely than any other professional to suffer from depression. Again, these are a variety of studies, and this one is particularly from the American Bar Association. Research shows that 11% of North Carolina lawyers have experienced suicidal ideation, and other states report similar trends. And this study also showed that the elevated levels of depression and anxiety are widespread in the legal profession. Also from the ABA, stress levels spiked significantly during law school. Depression rates among students climbed from 8 to 9% before school to 40% by graduation.
Mm.
Continuing on, another study found that lawyers' rates of depression, excuse me, and suicide outpace those in other high-stress professions. And a lack of mental health support and stigma around seeking help is often compounds the problem. We discussed that stigma. And according to other studies, lawyers are twice as likely to experience suicidal ideation compared to the general population. Attorneys have also been found to be at least twice as likely as the average person to die by suicide. An older study from the 90s found that suicide was the third leading cause of death among attorneys after cancer and heart disease. A Dave Nee Foundation, which is a think tank, did a study of lawyer depression in 2021 and found that lawyers are 3.6 times more likely to suffer from depression than non-lawyers. And so I share these statistics, although every study is going to be a little bit different. I think we see a trend in what they're all telling us. So I am wondering if there's anybody in our group that would like to comment on any of these statistics or have anything to add.
Well, very quickly, if I could jump in, Amy, thanks for sharing all that. First, I do want to note that there was a question in the chat that I think is relevant to the rest of this conversation, so I don't want to hold off until the end for it. They asked for a definition of what suicidal ideation actually is. If someone is in a dark place, thinks about not being alive, but never thinks anything beyond that, i.e. non-specific plan, is that suicidal ideation? Now, none of us on this call are medical professionals, so I'm putting that caveat out there. My experience having gone through therapy and counseling and psychology and psychiatry as a patient is that there are a variety of definitions of suicidal ideation, but in general, they tend to be categorized in 2 ways, which is passive suicidal ideation and active suicidal ideation. Passive typically refers to what you highlight of sort of dark thoughts, general non-specific thoughts about not being alive. I'm someone who actually, now that I've gotten a lot of therapy, I do this less, but I am someone who pretty frequently thinks like, I'm having a hard day. Geez, it would be nice if I weren't alive and didn't have to deal with that. Like that is, I personally don't even classify that as suicidal ideation because it's just sort of a fleeting negative thought. Now, there's also someone on the spectrum a bit more serious of really sort of thinking about like, I'm in a dark place. I really just don't feel like I should be alive, but I'm not thinking actively about taking that next step. My experience would be that would be called passive suicidal ideation as well. Active is really when it gets into, I am thinking about dying by suicide and I'm starting to think about a plan. I'm starting to think about how I would do so. I'm starting to daydream about doing so, things like that. So that's just responding to that question. In terms of the data itself, I mean, obviously the data is scary. There is also some indication that these rates are climbing. That data to me is a little bit, there are 2 ways to look at it. One is things are getting worse, which in some way in the world, possibly. The pandemic had a massively adverse effect on a lot of people's mental health. On the other way to think about it, though, is that more people are responding to surveys and openly saying, I have struggled with or I am struggling with, which is actually an indicator that stigma is reducing. So I somewhat view sometimes increasing rates of depression or suicidality as more people openly talking about what they're experiencing, which can be a good thing. So ups and downsides to the data. I view these numbers as being high, as somewhat of a, yes, this profession is extremely hard, but we're also moving in a direction that we're now more openly willing to put in a state bar sponsored questionnaire that, yeah, I'm struggling with that.
Very well said, Gavin. I appreciate the clarification. Absolutely. I think that was a great interpretation. Anybody else have any comments on the statistics or the impact that, or any contributing factors? That's a
Well,
big one.
yeah, to piggyback on what Gavin said, one of the things I've been very involved with the Texas Lawyers Assistance Program, and that we encourage people who are either struggling themselves or know someone who needs help, a lawyer, judge, law student who needs help, call the number, and somebody's going to pick up that phone 24/7. And we have found that in the last couple of years that 40% of the phone calls coming in are from law students. And so you can look at that both ways. Just like Gavin said, they are under incredible amount of stress. We have the statistics that show that, they come in at a certain level of maybe problem drinking, whatever your definition of problem drinking is, and then they leave by their third year with that increasing, threefold. But they also are more willing to reach out and seek help. Whereas maybe in the past, because of the stigma, because of the really lack of knowledge, where do I turn? And so I think we're doing a better job of saying, well, this is where you can turn. This is the help we can provide you. And then they are willing to reach out. And that's encouraging.
Yeah.
I just would like to add, and this is something that I say during CLE presentations, the landscape of the profession is changing generationally. And so we have, even though there are suicides amongst older lawyers and partners and what have you, I can say I have now firsthand experience with this. The thing that I have said is we can continue to pretend like this does not exist and dance all around it and what have you. But Gen Z is now here and they are going to be entering and trickling into the profession. I live with one. I live with a Gen Z who happens, I don't know why she decided to do this, but she decided to go to law school. She graduated and she is now in her first job. And the thing that I know about Gen Z, having lived with this, is they are very demanding and insistent about holding space for their own well-being. And they don't mind working really hard. They don't mind being creative. But what they do mind is this expectation that people like me, these older lawyers, of just suck it up and let's just keep going, because they're not going to just suck it up. And before we start saying that they are just entitled and spoiled and what have you, my response to that is stop getting mad at them, because we raised them. We are the ones who raised them. We're the ones who, and I mean this in a joking way, thought when they were having the day camp fairs, it would be great to send them to a cooking school in Thailand, and I'll work extra for this, that, or the other. Remember, we created this situation. And that's not necessarily, and I'm joking in a way, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we have raised them to expect better from life and to do better in their own lives. And so that's the landscape and the environment that we're going to be in. And just like every other profession, lawyers and legal employers are going to have to up their game and begin to fully embrace talking about and finding ways and holding space for people to be able to take care of their own mental health and well-being.
Very, very well said. Yes, Dan.
Yeah, since I've been living with depression over the past 23 years, I think this is a sign for optimism, cautious optimism, is
Mm-hmm.
that I think there's been a change in how stigma is experienced or thought about or in the legal
Mm-hmm.
profession. Um, Specifically, I think my experiences with stigma 23 years ago, where it became the kind of thing where I was thought of as less than because I had a mental illness, and sometimes that was painful, right? Uh, I remember when I disclosed this, my one partner, a friend of mine, said, "What are you going to do? End up begging on the street corner with a tin cup, or what's going to happen to the law firm if everybody finds this out?" Shaming
Mhm.
things. So I think we've come a long way in that
Mm-hmm.
regard. I think my experience is there's much less of that shaming, and it's more a question of silence. And silence, the problem with that is when you talk to people about it
Mm-hmm.
who may hear the story of someone with a mental illness or know of someone with a mental illness, it's not so much always that they think negatively of them, is that they don't know what to say. They
Mm-hmm.
don't know what to say. And what
Yeah.
I say then is that unfortunately the result can be the same, is that the
Mhm.
person who is experiencing mental health problems feels isolated and alone. And if you're going through depression, you're not a mind reader. You're not able to think, oh, that person really cares and loves about me. They just don't know what to say. That's not what you're thinking with your depressed brain. You're thinking quite the contrary. So I think when stigma goes down, treatment goes up. That's been my experience. And I think that's one of the powerful things about this gathering today is that in having an open discussion about this, we're dropping stigma, we're encouraging treatment, both for those listening who have a mental health condition, but also those listening who have a friend, colleague, loved one with mental health challenges.
Dan, so this is
If I could
okay.
quickly just jump in on one piece that I think Stephanie did a fabulous job sort of raising that intergenerational piece. It's one I love thinking through and talking about, but also digging into a little bit more specifically. I think Stephanie hit the nail on the head, but about that the next generation is being more noisy and more
Mm,
demanding about things. But the very interesting thing is, so Larry Richard, Dr. Larry Richard, psychologist, one of the original researchers on lawyer mental health and well-being, did some intergenerational research in this area and found that, yes, the younger generation is talking more about these issues, but there is actually no statistically significant difference in the level of resilience between younger lawyers and more senior lawyers. More
mm,
senior lawyers are experiencing the same levels of stress and anxiety in response to negative feedback, negative outcomes, negative issues, but they're not seeking help or talking about it, which actually leads to worse outcomes than a generation that is willing to recognize that they're experiencing serious impacts from their lack of resilience and seek help. So it's a really interesting nuanced distinction there.
yeah. And, again, that was going to be the question about stigma. So there are a few questions that I have. So on one hand, Dan, you talked about, well, what do you say? Right. And Terry specifically has that website is Stop Minding Your Own Business. So I'm wondering, Terry, I'm going a little bit um, off of our script here, but tell me a little bit about what that means and stop minding our own business. What do you say?
Well, and I will get to that. I want to tell you where Stop Minding Your Own Business came from, and I'll try to make this story short. It's an amazing story. I was emceeing an event in Dallas. It was a suicide awareness fundraiser, basically, and the speaker that was invited to speak, the keynote speaker, was from San Francisco, and so I was introducing him, and I wanted to find out about his story before I introduced him, and so he began to tell me his story of when he was 19 years old. He had undiagnosed mental health issues. He called it bipolar disorder. He was born with alcohol fetal syndrome, and so he had other problems, other issues that he didn't know how to deal with. But the bottom line is that he told me something that I will never forget, and he decided he was going to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge when he was 19 years old. And I'm like, Kevin, whoa. His name is Kevin Hines, by the way. Written a book. There are documentaries about this guy. I mean, Stephanie's shaking her head. She knows the story. It is an unbelievable story. Let me tell you, it ends well, because he did jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. But this is what he told me. He said, Terry, when a person decides, and not always, but for him, he said what he found is when a person decides to die by suicide, oftentimes they will make a pact with themselves. If this happens today, I won't die today. I may die tomorrow, but I won't die today. And he said to me, the pact he made with himself that day is, if one person asked me, are you okay? He would not jump. And he told me his entire day of encountering people as a 19-year-old young man and sobbing, and not one person said to him, son, are you okay? Do you need something? Well, when he got through telling me his story, I thought, oh my gosh, we have got to stop minding our own business. We can all say, are you okay? We can do that. And keep in mind, the Kevin Hines of the world, who might, if you just approach someone who might be struggling and say, are you okay? You are, as it has been mentioned here, you are reaching out to someone who is very lonely and isolated, and is really at a point where that suicidal crisis may be increasing. And when you do ask the question, are you okay? Are you thinking of harming yourself? By the way, as Gavin, to piggyback on Gavin again, asking that question will not plant the idea in someone's head. That is a myth. So you can say, when someone is really struggling, and your gut's going to tell you, ask the question, are you thinking of going away forever? Are you thinking of going to sleep and never wanting to wake up again? You can ask those questions, but then you need to be quiet and listen to the answers. And then oftentimes you ask the next question, and it is, do you have a plan? And I have done this, and people will tell me, yes, I am going to take a bottle of pills on Friday night when my family is at dinner. So I encourage people, number one, to ask the question, are you okay? I never pass anyone who's struggling. Never. If I see them crying in the courthouse, I'm stopping. And it's interesting, the look that they give me. They appreciate it. And they don't even know why they appreciate it, but it's just that somebody noticed them. So yes, I definitely encourage us to step out of our comfort zone and stop minding our own business.
That story just gave me the chills. And again, I think that's exactly right. And I think that also leads me to the next question. I recognize we don't have any psychologists or psychiatrists on this panel, but I want to talk about ways to potentially mitigate that suicide risk. And what do you think would have been helpful to your loved ones? And I think, again, Terry, you pretty much also said a lot. Stop minding your own business and ask the question. Anybody else, again, thinking about ways to mitigate that risk?
Yeah, I'll chime in. talked a lot about stigma, but I think Dan really hit a point that I want to emphasize here, which is silence. Silence creates so if I wrote an article for the ABA about this, actually, at the encouragement of a leader at the Mass Board of Bar Overseers, who I won't name. But if especially I'll say younger lawyers coming up through the ranks, don't see lawyers in the positions to which they're aspiring, partners, judges, professors, leaders, if they don't see them talking openly about times when they've struggled and the resources they've used to get through those circumstances, then the silent signal, as Dan said, the silence, the message that's delivered is, and that's internalized, is you will never be able to succeed at that level if you are open about getting what you're struggling with and asking for help. So I have been a massive believer, and people have asked me time and time again, what could have prevented you from reaching that point? And I say the number one thing was, if I had seen lawyers in my dream jobs saying, I'm in therapy, I have a diagnosis of depression, I am on antidepressants, I have used an EAP, I have called the lawyer assistance program. If I'd seen that, I would have believed it was okay to do so and still been able to succeed. So my biggest message is, if you have any personal lived experience with this, when you feel safe and ready, find ways to tell your story. Find ways to make your lived experience known. Find ways to share it, particularly with the up and coming generation, so that they know they can reach the level of success to which you've made it, and still be able to get help without feeling the signal that getting help will cap their ability to succeed in this profession.
Oh, go
Yes,
ahead.
Dan.
Yeah, real quick, I saw a question in the chat box about what law schools can do. I just want to speak to that because I'm currently a professor at the University of Buffalo Law School, where I teach a class I started called Mental Health and Wellbeing in the Legal Profession. So by way of reference, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe, we have 15 law schools in New York State. I'm on a statewide committee on this, and I know all the law school deans at those schools. And when I was thinking about teaching a course like this, I asked all of them, do any of you have a class that talks about, in any depth, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation? And the answer was no. We have classes about well-being, mindfulness, stress management, which are wonderful things that I strongly believe in. So what I did was, when I went to the dean at UB to tell her my ideas, I said, in essence, the statistics, what the other deans had said, and I said, my God, what message are we sending to these young people that, there's a mental health crisis in the legal profession, including law students, but we're not going to talk about it at all. We're not going to prepare them for anything. We're not going to destigmatize any of this. That's just a lot of bullshit. And so she goes, okay, what do you want to do about it? And I said, well, I want to teach this class. So it's been one of the best parts of my life, teaching these 50 young minds. And at the end of the semester, I asked them for a confidential 10-page reflection paper about what they've learned. It's mind-blowing to see how honest these and authentic these young people are. And to go to Stephanie's point about generational change, I think that's very, very, very true. And I think that on one hand, it's so good to see that, but I worry, right, about the younger generation and middle-aged lawyers, because we do live in a tough society. I mean, putting aside the legal profession, a polarized society. One of the biggest things that I think contributes, we talk about burnout and things like that, but I wrote down a note, is the lack of civility in the legal profession. What is that talking about? We're talking about values, integrity, these are values, they're moral values, really. And I think one of the things we don't talk about enough as a profession is the moral component of the life we lead as lawyers. And what that does, I think, to people from the inside out. I think it's corrosive to people. I think a lot of lawyers feel emotionally, spiritually bankrupt. So when we talk about this kind of unhappiness, it pushes up against these notions of depression. And what is the dividing line between those things, right? There isn't always a precise dividing line. I could think of myself and my brother who passed away, but myself in particular. I was very good at being a lawyer, but I was very unhappy at being a lawyer. And I think many, many people go into the profession not knowing full well what it involves to be a lawyer, the commitment, the strain, those kinds of things. And then the other thing, and then I'll be quiet. I read this great article years ago in the New York Times. It was an interview with a Supreme Court Justice law clerk who went on to become a famous writer. And she was asked about, what's going on with all this lawyer stuff, this lawyer unhappiness. She goes, well, 50% of people who go to law school, become lawyers, don't want to be lawyers. They just don't know what else to do. So they drift into the profession. I would say that's me. I had an undergraduate degree in psychology. I didn't know what to do with my life. Law school seemed like a good idea. And I'll tell you, some of the best moments of my life are as being a lawyer. That is true. But at the same time, it wasn't very good for my mental and physical well-being. It just wasn't. So maybe one thought process is when we talk about this is when people are, thinking of going to law school or after they get out, really doing a better job at steering them towards legal careers that fit their personalities. Introverts should not be pushed into courtrooms, and people that have a passion for civil rights should not be doing products liability defense. But that too often happens, and not just for financial reasons. It happens a lot.
So I know that Stephanie was going to say something, and so I want to get to you. We do have lots of questions and comments, so I want to get to that. And then I do have one more final question for the panel. So Stephanie, please take it away.
Okay, so in addition to what Gavin and Terry and Dan have said, the thing that I want to add is it starts at the top. And so what I mean by that is the individuals who are the gatekeepers in the profession have got to come to terms. First of all, it's got to start with them. And the legal profession is really no different. When people start talking about wanting to change workspaces and how do we make these places much less toxic and encourage people to take better care of themselves, the question that I ask is, there are two. Do you trust your employees, and do your employees trust you? You can't come in and say, okay, we're going to do well-being now. And most people, I think that when people say well-being, they think we're going to all like sing Kumbaya and make s'mores. And that is not what this is. So the question you have to, in leadership, has to ask some hard questions and be willing to hear what people have to say, recognize and understand that they may hear nothing but silence or crickets, and that may be because your employees do not trust you enough to be open with you about what's happening with them. And if you don't trust your employees, they already know that you don't trust them, which then means that there's going to be some resentment and some other kinds of things that you're going to have to somehow unravel before we can even get to the point of holding space for people who are having who have mental health conditions, who may be really dealing with issues that impact them. And so that is the first thing. The gatekeepers have to start. The gatekeepers have to ask themselves hard questions, and they have to be willing to also answer questions about their own mental health, answer questions and come to terms with their own mental health conditions that they have been suppressing, self-medicating, running from, however you want to describe it, for their entire career. And so you need to look at that and do some work on the front end. And then perhaps, hopefully, through that process, you can begin to cultivate an atmosphere and a relationship where people feel safe to come out and begin openly addressing and having these kinds of conversations. The last thing I'll just say is this. So I now work for NAMI Franklin County in Ohio. And this afternoon, as we normally do on a monthly basis, we met with our therapists. Yes, we actually have a therapist in our office.
Wow.
And she works with us as a staff so that we can have a healthy workplace. But she also will work with us individually. And we had a session today where we had to really begin talking about where we as a staff have been over the last 2 years, what it is that we are struggling with, both personally and professionally. And we also had to be able to say things to each other that we might not have been able to say if the ground had not been prepared for us to have those conversations. Because if the ground wasn't prepared, then the way that we would have taken what was said, we wouldn't have been able to have that conversation. And is it maybe uncomfortable or difficult maybe to hear or something? Maybe. But we all recognize and are committed as a staff to this process to do this work so that we can be healthy, because we cannot serve the individuals and families we serve if we are empty and struggling and stressed out and dealing with our own mental health issues. Because we each are people, whether we're a family member or an individual, with lived experience. So it's work, but it's important and it is valuable. And if we are going to be in this profession, we have to deal with the things that make us most uncomfortable and just stop thinking that we are widgets or machines or something. We're people.
That's Stephanie, you again hit the nail on the head, right? We're people. And there is something about that legal community that sometimes strips away that identity. So again, we do have a number of questions and comments. I want to get to those before we do. Any last words, anything that I haven't asked you about, any advice, anything you want this audience, the community to know?
I'm going to make a recommendation. Read a book called Why We Sleep. I think that, you won't believe what sleep will do for you and the practice of law. Read that book. It will change your life.
That's excellent, Terry. By the way, we do a lot of programming on sleep and the importance of sleep, not only to your physical being, but your mental health and your well-being. And that is one of the top two, if not number one on well-being, mental health well-being. So thank you for that. I'm going to put that book in the chat. Anybody else? Sorry, go ahead.
One thing that I would suggest, there are a couple of things. First, if you do not feel that it is safe to have these conversations within your own workplace, find your tribe. You know, I've been doing this now for 36 years, and for the bulk of my career, I never really felt like I fit in the profession.
Mm.
And it really wasn't until I started telling my own story and started doing some of the work that I've been doing that I really felt as if I could make a contribution. But the thing that I have done is I had to find a tribe of people who I trust, but who trust me enough to tell me the truth. And you know, look, find, so if that, you know, you've got to find that create one safe space and people who can help hold that space for you. Find a therapist if you need one. And sleep is would help a lot of things, I think, in not just the profession, but in the legal in the world and in this country. The other thing, I saw someone ask, where can I tell my story? The one thing I started doing when I was writing is I started finding spaces, and the one that most of my work is, I put most of my work now is Medium. You can create your account on Medium and you can start writing and putting your work out there, and keep doing it in that way if you feel comfortable doing it there. Storytelling is transformational. It has been so cathartic. I didn't start doing it for this reason, but I have found it to be very cathartic. And it also really keeps me honest with myself, where I have to ask myself this question. I ask myself the question, are you doing this because you truly are committed to helping people, or are you doing it for your own benefit? Because if so, you need to stop. You for your own personal benefit, because otherwise I have to believe this and live this out. Because if I'm not willing to live it out, they're just pretty words on a page.
Mm.
But I think that finding that space where you can tell your story. The last thing I'll leave is a resource. And this has become my go-to. Every week, every Wednesday from 12 o'clock p.m. to 1 o'clock p.m., there is something called the 988 Crisis Jam. It comes on, and you can find the Crisis Jam or the link and articles and other things about it on Crisis Talk. But it is, they cover stories and resources from all across the country that are focused on and cover a variety of topics in the area of mental health, well-being, suicide, just a wide variety of topics and conversation and experts. It is probably the most productive hour where I can get a lot of information that has proven to be extremely helpful.
Excellent. So we do have 15 minutes left. So Dan and Gavin, we want to hear from you. And then I'm seeing some other questions I'd like to pose to the group.
Dan,
Oh,
you're muted.
You're muted.
I'm sorry. With my law school class, and I also teach at the New York State Judicial Institute, we have 1,500 judges. And one
Mm.
of the things I do with them, especially I'll talk about the law students, but applies to everybody, is my class is extremely popular, not because of my IQ or my delivery, but it's the cheapest class to take. So the only book that it required to buy is a composition book like you'd buy at Dwayne Reed or Walgreens, cost about $1.50. I assume they have their own pens or pencils. They bring that to class. They can't open their laptops or computers. So what are they going to do with that? So I tell them what we're going to do. We're going to talk about one of the tools I talk about is the practice of gratefulness, which sounds like, boy, how can you be grateful when you're depressed, Dan? But there's a lot of ways to talk about it, and I talk about it in great detail. And one of the things they do is beginning day one, they begin writing a paragraph about something that they've experienced in their daily life for which they appreciate, the good things they appreciate. There's more involved than that, but that you'll get the idea. But what they do also, I add a second component. Each day to the right of that, they have to put in the amount of time they've spent on their social media or cell phone accounts, right?
Mm.
And what's fascinating is as the semester goes on, that number goes down, 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 down. Because once we raise our awareness about how much time we're wasting, and it becomes pretty obvious what the heck we're doing. And the biggest lament I hear from lawyers, judges, law students, Dan, these are great ideas, but I don't have time. Well, I say it's a lot of nonsense, a lot of baloney, because if you do this little exercise, and I'm no different, you'll see that you do have time. It's just that we're not aware always of how we're using our time. So instead of, if you find out the average person spends adult 4 or 5 hours on their phones or laptops, but they found out that half of that time is spent on social media, news, checking in Facebook, CNN. So even if you took 20 minutes of that time and you devoted it to something else, what a better place the world would be and our own uh, personal and collective lives would be.
And great. I love that. I love that. And social media, we know, can be quite damaging to our mental health. Gavin, any last words or anything that you want to share before we move on to those questions?
I'd rather give time to the questions.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start. There are a couple of just comments. One person thanked everyone really for sharing their stories. And then somebody else commented, my son decided he would not become a lawyer because of the stress he saw me experience in the profession. A question is, what advice do you have for people who want to seek help without ruining future career opportunities and insurance coverage? For example, this person was denied a short-term disability insurance policy because they have ADHD and depression diagnosis. Some life insurance company won't honor a policy if the insured died by suicide. It's great to encourage others to speak up, but we don't want to set people up for failure. Any comments?
Yeah, so I had seen this question pop up. And I think, so first off, I will frame, I think a number of the questions I've seen come in, we have 6 minutes and are not going to be able to solve. One of the questions is, what should law schools be doing to help prevent suicidal behavior by lawyers? Like that's not going to get solved in this next 6 minutes. I will say in response to this question, I think it is important to recognize the systemic challenges and financial realities of the insurance industry and the way the American healthcare system operates. My perspective is if you are at thoroughly investigating your employer's benefits coverage is critical, and making some potentially real decisions about where you choose to work in the legal industry based on benefits understanding is also important. I am very proud of my firm's strategy to already have very sort of strong benefits for our team members and continue to improve those, because we don't want to be in a situation where someone asking for help winds up financially penalizing them. We want to be in a situation where asking for help at worst comes out financially neutral and potentially comes out financially better, and comes out better from a professional development, responsibility, and potential liability standpoint, let alone the moral good reasoning for doing so as to improve mental health, well-being, and mitigate risk of suicide.
Excellent.
I'm saying to fiddle with my microphone a little bit. Very shortly, I said, American healthcare system problematic. Investigate your benefits coverage where you work. Make some real decisions about where you want to work in the legal profession based on some of those benefits decisions. You can't be in. I always like to say, your finances don't matter when you're dead. So if a job is going to cost you your life, or if a insurance decision is going to cost you your life, it is time to make a different decision.
Yeah, I want to add, check into FMLA. I heard a good CLE on that you might want to look into that. And then also, I encourage you to look into your LAP, your Lawyer's Assistance Program. In Texas, we have a scholarship fund where if people do not have insurance, you can apply for a scholarship for inpatient, for medication, and also for therapy. So look into that. Use your LAP. Everyone should use their Lawyer's Assistance Program. So check that out.
And I will just add, yes, absolutely. I'm in favor of that. We are the Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers from Massachusetts, LAP. And we too have something very similar. So if you're somebody that cannot afford inpatient treatment or something along those lines, please reach out and we'll see what we can do. So thank you, Terry, for emphasizing, again, the LAP program, because we are here and dedicated to lawyers and the legal community here in Massachusetts. There is a question: if someone wants to continue to work in the litigation field, do you have any suggestions for how to deal with the double whammy of stress created by the nature of the adversarial system and the standards for success, largely winning? Any comments?
This was going to be where I was going to emphasize what Terry just said, which is that sounds like a really good opportunity to reach out to your LAP, your lawyer assistance program, because they are specialists in supporting lawyers in various specific practice areas. So it sounds like first off, why do you genuinely want to be continuing in the litigation field if you are struggling to such a extreme degree? Ask yourself that question. But if you do want to continue, I think it's a great opportunity to reach out to your lawyer assistance program to discuss.
Excellent. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I was a litigator for almost 30 years while living with depression. So I think that could be a whole nother CLE just on that one topic. I bet you Terry would agree with that as a litigator. Stephanie too. But I think that there's a lot to unpack. I think one of the things that is true is that you're getting to the point here, aren't you, by even asking that question, where you know it's important to find a solution, find some answers for your own mental health and well-being. That's a big first step, because for many of us, that wasn't even on the radar. We just kept pressing forward, and we're trying to encourage people not to do that.
And one of the questions, thank you, Dan, one of the questions that was asked is, where do you speak? And I know Stephanie addressed it earlier, but I just want to emphasize that this is exactly what we're doing. And we love volunteers to talk about their recovery and any anxiety, depression that they've experienced. This is one of the ways of reducing that stigma. So I think it's beneficial for the person speaking as well as for the others. And related to that, somebody mentions, I think it is important to tell your story in the community. And when people who have struggled with depression and anxiety speak about their experience in their own community, it does two things. It empowers people to talk about their own experience, and it lets people know they are not alone. And that is one of the biggest takeaways, I think, from this particular panel discussion is you are not alone and there is help out there. I'll continue. This person said, the more awareness people have about others having gone through suffering and is depression or has depression and anxiety, the more we can peel the scab off the stigma. Gavin said it right, that we need to talk about it and let others know. So thank you again for that comment. We do have 5 minutes. I do want to mention a few things. Somebody again says, thank you for holding the space. Another comment, an attorney shared with other attorneys that I had attempted suicide. I have seen attorneys at grocery stores and at restaurants who have gone out of their way to avoid me. I am not sure I can gain the confidence to go back to the courts where I've practiced. Any suggestions? This person also has, I've disabled my license and I'm in the process of reinstatement. Any suggestions about where to get professional liability? But perhaps we can address the first, that first question. Again, any suggestions? They've lost their confidence.
One thing I would say real quick, I was just thinking of a comment or a story I read someplace. That courage, which I think is very courageous of this person, it isn't the absence of fear, but it's the fear, you feel the fear because you're a real human being, but continuing to move forward in some form is what you're thinking of doing. And I think the more structured and planned out you can be about what you're trying to do, the better. Because I know with me, 50% of people with depression have anxiety too. Most people do. So it's a common experience of feeling overwhelmed and then unmotivated. Those two things can keep us locked and stuck in place. So I think as many allies as you could bring to the table, the better off you'd be. Not only a therapist, but a peer support group. There's many lawyer support groups through your LAP. But also, it may very well be worth your time consulting with a lawyer about the readmission process and some other things to get your team and as Stephanie said, your tribe. That's really true.
And I'll just add to that, Dan, is that Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers here in Massachusetts, we do have a support group that is run by Barbara Bowe. She is one of our clinicians on staff. So if folks want to go to our website at lclma.org, you can check out that group. We do have a variety of other support groups, whether ADHD, solo, or immigration lawyers. So please, again, there are a lot of resources on our website. And again, we have free services to meet with one of our 4 clinicians. Somebody else wrote, hugely important to be able to recognize when your mood is slipping and to identify those things. Exercise, medication, yoga, meditation, being in nature, etc., that help you maintain a good sense of well-being.
Yeah, if I could sort of quickly respond to that and
Yes.
sort of give my closing thought here. Responding to that point, I think it's absolutely important to recognize when your mood is slipping and what works for you. But I think it's also important to recognize when you are at a place where you can't, where you alone cannot support your well-being. And that is the time, or that is already a bit far to be asking for help, but if you haven't reached out for help by that point, do so then. And then relatedly, the final point I want to make is, and it relates to that attorney who shared their story about losing confidence and getting reinstated. It is possible to thrive and be a successful lawyer with a mental illness. And I want to say that for the people in the back. All of us here, or at least 3 of us here, have personal diagnoses of mental illness. I have been diagnosed with severe chronic depression with suicidal ideation. And I can tell you, judges, partners, leaders, professionals, and professors who are out there who have been diagnosed, who are in treatment, on medication, in therapy, and are successful. So I do not want anyone to leave this program thinking medically or mentally ill and competence to practice law cannot go hand in hand. You can be a brilliant lawyer with a diagnosis of mental illness. The key component is sometimes you just have to ask for help and get the support you need to be able to thrive at the level you need.
Yeah.
Gavin, that was an amazing last comment to end this panel discussion on. That was just fantastic. And I want to say thank you again to all of our panelists. You were amazing. I think you provided incredibly valuable insight, bravery again to share your stories. And I think that it absolutely, I have no doubt, helped folks in this audience and for those that will be viewing it in the future. So thank you all so much. You were really, I can't thank you enough for sharing your story and for all the advice and thoughts on this. I know the feedback that I'm seeing is just so amazing, and everybody does feel the same. So thank you so much. And again, folks, reach out to LCL if you do need that help.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.